we should understand that there are two types of markets when we are talking of energy in the world. We tend to call them additional markets and replacement markets. Additional markets we call to those markets in which the energy demand keeps growing and growing, and you actually need to add new capacity for the market to work well. And usually those markets are quite good at working with competitive processes, let's say. Then you also have the replacement markets. The replacement markets are those markets in which usually the energy demand doesn't grow anymore. For example, Europe in general is like this, United States is like this as well. Basically, they're the markets where you have a lot of capacity installed and there are goals for renewables, but there's not a growth in the energy demand. So actually you need to displace some technology in order to implement new technology. And there is an extra difficulty for that if you take into account the kind of regulation that it exists nowadays in those markets. So what you need in those markets, usually you need support from the government or from the regulator in order to give the right signs to the market for how they want the electricity market to become. This means they shouldn't be subsidizing fossil fuels if they want to get rid of fossil fuels, such things like this. Then when we go to what kind of regulation you need in both, there is one thing that it's in common for every market, which is long-term vision. The most important thing for investors is long-term vision. As long as you have a plan which covers, let's say at least 5-10 years, because at the end of the day, a renewable project needs some time to develop, then it needs some time of construction, and that it will be running for a lot of years. So you need some clarity in the future. If you can have this long-term vision, everything gets much easier. And there's something else which is very, very desirable, which is a consensus, which means not just a long-term vision, but also this should be agreed by all the main key regulators, because sometimes we have experienced that, yes, there was a long-term vision, but then the government changes and the long-term vision ends and it's not long anymore, but short. So that's key to every market. Then when we go to these two different markets that we spoke about, the necessities are different. So when we go to additional markets, as we said, it's fantastic. They're just trying to add power, and they're just trying to add cheap power, of course, because they want to be competitive. Electricity is a key strategic issue for all the industry of the country to be competitive, so it needs to be cheap. And the very good news is that renewables is already competitive with most of the other kind of electricity generation in the places where there is good resource. And as an example, if you take a look at Chile, there was a tender some time ago which was technologically agnostic, so anyone could participate. This means old plants, new plants, fossil fuel plants, renewable plants, and a lot of capacity was allocated to renewable power plants. This means that we were there, at least indeed, already completely competitive with other sources. Of course, coming back to what I said before, this depends a lot on the kind of subsidies that you provide. If you have a subsidy to fossil fuels, it's more difficult for renewables to be competitive. At the same time, we also think that it's important to really internalize all the costs in this competition. So if you're making different energies compete, you need to take into account everything that is related to them in terms of cost. And that's why we believe that a carbon tax is very important, because it really puts all the prices in the LCOEs for the tenders that you're going to celebrate. So additional markets, long-term vision, competitive tenders, or any other mechanism that mitigate risks for investors in the long term works well. And regulators, please just give the appropriate signs. If you want a renewable mix, give the appropriate signs for that. What happens with the markets in which we have already enough megawatts to cover for our demand? It looks like it's not growing, and still there are plans for renewables, and we want to have renewables implemented. Again, we want a competitive electricity market. So we don't want to charge citizens or clients of any sort with extra prices because of having an extra capacity. So I think it's very important that the regulators make a good plan of how they want the mix to look like. And once that they have made this plan, they have clear decisions on how to replace the idle, the old, the obsolete, the pollutant plants that don't have a room there anymore. Of course, there has to be an answer for those plants, but at the same time, we cannot sustain a system in which the overcapacity is such that makes the whole system too expensive for the clients.